6:31.
The Parliament sat today and the repeal of the mining tax as well as the report from the government's own Commission of Audit were on the agenda. Then there was the announcement late in the day by the Finance Minister to pause the introduction of those controversial changes the government wants to make to weaken the laws around financial advice and commissions and bonuses paid to advisors. Now, as we've just been talking about, a storm of protests from various quarters has been building. The government is keen to stem the controversy. Well, joining me now to discuss all these issues are Darren Chester, Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Defence and Nationals MP for Gippsland, and Shadow Assistant Health Minister Stephen Jones, who's the Labor MP for Throsby. Gentlemen, welcome to you both.
Good to be with you.
Good evening.
Now, we'll get to the changes to financial advice in a moment, but first, the Senate is debating the mining tax repeal. Now, most expect it not to pass this Senate. Let's have a listen to Independent Senator Nick Xenophon about this and the carbon tax issue.
I would think it's more likely than not that the carbon tax is going to be repealed, as well as the mining tax. Both were very flawed in their execution and in their modelling. Look, a lot of water under the bridge between now and July, but I think there seems to be a feeling that the new Senate needs to work in the national interest.
Stephen Jones, shouldn't Labor support this repeal? I mean, given the coalition won a big majority at the last election, why not do it now if it's going to be done after July?
Helen, every person who stood as a Labor Member of Parliament did so on a platform on both of these issues. We have a mandate just as the government claims a mandate. They're absolutely right to put their legislation forward, but we've got an obligation to follow through on the proposition that we said we didn't support it. We don't think now is the time. We don't think now is the time to be giving a tax cut to mining companies. We actually think that is in the national interest that we have a profits-based tax in the mining industry. If the government wanted to sit down and negotiate some changes to deal with what Senator Xenophon describes as some of the design issues, we'd be more than happy to do that. But we believe a profits-based tax is what is needed for the mining sector to ensure that Australians get a share of the benefits of our mineral wealth.
Darren Chester, do you expect that you will in fact have to wait till the new Senate? Do you agree with Senator Xenophon about that?
Well, it's entirely in the hands of the Australian Labor Party and their partners, the Greens. I mean, what we have at the moment is an opposition leader who's hopelessly conflicted on this issue. When he's in Western Australia campaigning for the Senate by-election, he seems all pro the mining industry. When he comes back to Canberra, he instructs his troops to vote against the mining tax. The opposition leader is hopelessly conflicted on the issue. He needs to say one thing in Western Australia and actually do the same thing when he gets back to Canberra. At the moment, he's not too sure what he wants to do.
Let's be very clear about that. Bill Shorten has said that he's willing to sit down and look at some of the design issues of the Minerals Resources Rent Tax with the industry, with the government, with all the relevant stakeholders. If there are design issues, then we should look at them, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. No conflict, no difference of what he says over east and whatever he says over west.
But Stephen Jones, he actually has not guaranteed to put it as part of Labor policy at the next election.
Now, what he said is that he still believes in the principle of a profits-based tax in the mining industry. And let's not forget that's what the MRRT was all about.
So it might be changed from the current one.
Look, absolutely. If there are design issues that need to be looked at, then of course you'd look at them. But that doesn't get away from the fundamental principle that it's a lot better to tax mining companies on the basis of their profits as opposed to the amount of dirt they dig out of the ground, and that's what the royalty system's all about.
All right, well, the government is still looking over the report from its Commission of Audit, whose chair last week said it should be made public. Now, will it be made public, Darren Chester, before the WA half-Senate election in less than 2 weeks?
Well, both the Treasurer and the Prime Minister have answered that question publicly in the last week, in that the report has been received, and you won't be surprised to hear this, that a Parliamentary Secretary doesn't get access to that report ahead of it being released by either the Prime Minister or the Treasurer. I think the government's position is quite fair and reasonable, where the ministers responsible are looking closely at that audit, considering the recommendations in that. I understand it's only a draft report at this stage, just as the previous government with its Henry tax review and the Gonski report held on those documents for several months before any release was made public. I mean, it's entirely reasonable for a mature and responsible government to take its time in considering something which is a very important report.
But is there some government reluctance to reveal it? Because there will no doubt be lots of cuts proposed.
Well, I think what you need to recognise is that this government is very different from the previous government, and we're not out there looking to announce something every day and rushing around helter-skelter trying to unveil things which aren't properly prepared. This government is going to take a mature and considered approach to what is a very important reforms that may well be proposed in the Commission of Audit. So I think it's entirely reasonable for the Treasurer, the Prime Minister and our other responsible ministers to consider this interim report and to consider those recommendations before it goes rushing off to some launch.
Come on, Darren, you put out a press release this morning announcing that you'd set up a subcommittee. So you're more than happy to try and get a story out of it. Here's one thing you could guarantee, Helen. If there was good news for the voters of Western Australia in the Commission of Audit report, every coalition Senate candidate would be wandering around, waving it around everywhere they went. There's no good news for Western Australia or anywhere else. That's why it won't see the light of day till after the election.
I know it suits Stephen to be mischievous about it, but the announcement of the Senate by-election was nothing within the government's purview. Of course, the fact that we are back at the polls had nothing to do with the government's decision to announce a Commission of Audit. These two events have synchronised for no other reason than the AEC sought to have a new election because of the bungle we saw in Western Australia. So this confluence of events is not within the government's control, in the sense that I think it's only reasonable that the Treasurer, the Prime Minister, the responsible ministers take their time and consider what is a very serious report.
Don't disagree. No, I'm not blaming you for the election. Absolutely agree. It had nothing to do with you. But if there was good news in it, I guarantee you'd have it out there in the lead up to the Western Australian election. There's no good news in there for Western Australia.
I just want to move on and ask you, Darren Chester, on that Commission of Audit, will defence spending be quarantined from cuts?
Well, the government has made it very clear in the lead up to the election about its view in relation to defence spending. We saw under the previous Labor government $18 billion cut out of defence over 4 years, and we've made it very clear that we can't afford to be making those sort of cuts to defence and then still expecting to meet our capability needs in the future. So I haven't seen the report, I haven't seen the interim report, I haven't seen any information relating to it in any detail, but I understand the government is continuing to maintain its promise in relation to defence. We won't be cutting it the way the previous government did. We're going to make sure that our defence men and women are properly able to serve our needs into the future.
The financial reforms that have been going ahead they were brought into the Parliament last week. They were going to be moved on this week. The Finance Minister, Matthias Cormann, has said this afternoon he'll only pause the changes until he reminds all the key stakeholders, he said, of what they agreed to before the election. So, Darren Chester, that sounds like they are going ahead.
Well, I did see the Finance Minister's statement this afternoon in that he will pause the implementation of the regulations, which I think is only reasonable in the circumstances. You need to remember that this legislation being proposed by the Finance Minister was the subject of a consultation period in late January. I understand that in the order of 50 submissions were made to that consultation process, so the Minister and the government has been working with the sector. I also understand that the Minister's intention that given the legislation which is before the Parliament now has been referred to the Senate's Economics Committee, it's only reasonable for him to pause implementation of those regulations until such time as he's able to consult in good faith with the industry. So I think it's only reasonable in the circumstances, and the Minister, I'm sure, will continue to work with the industry and in the best interests of consumers.
Well, let's have a listen to what the Opposition's Chris Bowen said about this afternoon.
Now, just this morning, the Finance Minister showed that he didn't understand his own reforms. He said on Twitter that the changes were not bringing back commissions. He just plainly didn't understand them. And now that he's had all day to look at them, and presumably he does understand them, he's decided to freeze them. That's how bad they are. But a freeze is only a good first step if it leads to the policy being dropped altogether.
Now, the financial planners themselves, the head of Financial Planning Association, Matthew Rowe, has said, "We don't believe that a commission should be payable on any form of investment or superannuation, regardless of whether it's specific personal advice or general advice." Why is the government wanting to push ahead with these changes, Darren Chester?
Well, I think there are several things about this area of reform that the government and the opposition both agree on. We both agree there is a need to provide quality advice to improve consumer Australian people's confidence in the sector in the wake of some very serious collapses they've seen in the past. So I think there is some goodwill there across the chamber in that regard. But the government had a view, and I share that view, that the previous government, the Rudd-Gillard government, overreached with its regulatory burden and actually created a situation where there were more burdens, more regulations having impact on small business, and wasn't in the best interest of the future of the sector. So
right,
that is where I suppose we part company. We believe
sorry,
that the
Darren,
previous
I do have to interrupt you. I'm terribly sorry. We are going to go live now to the Malaysian authorities on the latest information they have on the missing plane.